In this presentation, we'll look at how to annotate an unseen literary extract in order to produce a convincing interpretation for an exam essay. On the old IB Paper 1 spec, that's the spec that ends in 2020, the unseen extract can either be poetry or prose, fiction or a non-fiction extract. The techniques offered here, though, are suitable for the IB Board's exam and any other exam board that offers an unseen literary extract analysis paper. For most unseen text, you have about 20 to 30 minutes annotation time. So today we're going to look at what should you do in that time. And the answer obviously is C, annotate. When I read students' essays, however, it's clear to me that not all of them know what they should be looking for when annotating the text, because their final essays are less than convincing. Like any story, the extract should take you on a journey. There'll be a start point, some tension created by contrasting thoughts and emotions or contrasting characters' ideas, and then one way or another, that tension should be resolved. That is what you're looking for. It should look something like this. There'll be an exposition, setting character, thoughts and emotions, and then an introduction of contrasting ideas, either through contrasting characters or there may be conflicting emotions within the main character, and then as the extract continues, a shifting attitude whereby these conflicting ideas or thoughts or emotions are resolved. So to summarize that part, when you're annotating, you're looking for the journey. How is the conflict or contrast resolved? One more thing before we begin. At what level of abstraction should you work at? The question is, when is a seller not a seller? I was reading an essay on the bell jar the other day where Esther goes down 7 steps into a basement restaurant with Constantine. So far as I was concerned, she went down 7 steps into a basement restaurant with Constantine and that was that. But the student was trying to suggest that the descent was not just a literal descent but an emotional one too. I wasn't convinced, however. So let's take a look at some possible symbolic interpretations for a cellar and then see if we can work out a rule. On a literal level, the cellar is just a cellar. It's a basement, maybe a storage place or whatever it is below the ground floor of the house. If you're into psychoanalysis, you might claim that a cellar represents suppressed personal memories. A little bit like what the student was trying to say when he was suggesting it was a descent into some negative emotion. On a deeper level, you might even think it represents suppressed familial memories, and if you're a Jungian, you might want to claim it's the collective unconscious, or maybe even one of Dante's circles of hell, depending on what's going on there. So the question is, what is the rule? And I would say that you only move to the next level of abstraction or the next level of symbolism when you're absolutely certain that the text will support it. That you can pick out evidence that will show that this is not just to be interpreted at a literal level, but there is some deeper symbolism at play. And you move down or up the level of abstraction with caution. Let me give you an example of one that you could argue is more symbolic. So when Hardy leans upon the coppice gate, and I think in his poem The Darkling Thrush, that's written at the turn of the century, then the gate is a physical gate, but it also represents movement from one century into the next, from the 19th century into the 20th century, and perhaps also movement from his despair into a slight sense of optimism as he hears the thrush sing the song. So at that point you could claim that the gate is not just a literal gate, but there are various levels of symbolism behind it. When analysing a text, and that's not just a poetry, although this is usually used for poetry, then I like to use a version of TP Cast. I must be able to paraphrase on a literal level what the text is about, and then explore the various literary devices that are at play and look for shifts in attitude, ideas or tones. Once I've read the text through a few times, if it's a poem, I should have a deeper appreciation of the title and then be able to work out the themes in the text. So, let's begin our annotation. Okay then, let's see if we can actually do some annotation. So, the subject of the poem is Frankie Lane. Whatever you're going to argue that this poem is about, it must be related to Frankie Lane. Now that may seem a little bit obvious, but I've read essays that barely mention him in the first verse, because Lane himself isn't mentioned in the first verse, but whatever's going on in that sweet shop has to relate to Frankie Lane because that's the subject of the poem. The asterisk tells us that Frankie Lane was a crooner type singer who had a couple of big hits, and the parenthesis afterwards suggests that this is going to be an elegy or at least a commemoration or a celebration of his life. The Stevens Sweet Shop, 1949. So that's the location. The Stevens Sweet Shop's a noun phrase. It just sets the setting, the environment. You might want to argue that the sibilance there creates a sense of excitement. I'm not sure that I would argue that. 1949 is obviously important. It's an important date in the poem, and it represents post-war America, boom time, optimism, a sense of hope that the war's ended and things are going to get better. So that's the setting, and then what's going on in that setting is detailed in the next 9 lines, and those 9 lines are just presented as one sentence in the present tense, and it creates almost a sense of intense activity. Let's take a look at it. So Baldwit at work. You could argue that the nickname Baldwit suggests a sense of familiarity, and he's at work, and he certainly is at work because we get 3 verbs there: butterflying, splitting and serving up these hot dogs. So there's a lot of movement going on. You could argue that butterflying is, on a literal level, he's just splitting the hot dogs ready for the griddle, so you get a sense of activity and a sense of smell. On a symbolic level, butterflies obviously have transitioned from caterpillars, and this poem is about a transition that's going on. So whilst this goes on, his wife Boo, again another nickname, and at this point she's just sketched out smiling, slightly anxious wife. It introduces something that's sort of a little bit of anxiety into the poem, that, you know, adulthood isn't necessarily a perfect place, a rigid perm and excess too bright lipstick, maybe she's covering something up there, you could argue out, but it's only just hinted at. And his wife is providing sugary poisons to teenage guzzlers. Well, let's tackle the teenage part of it to start off with. Teenagers are on the cusp of adulthood. It's a remarkably exciting time. They're going to leave the security of home and go out into the world and make whatever it is that they're going to make of their lives. And in a way, teenagers that transition from childhood to adulthood. And you could argue that Stevens Sweet Shop is the location where this transition takes place, so that they're not in the family home and they're not necessarily in the outside world. You know, they're being served sugary drinks. It's still sort of teenager, but on the cusp of adulthood. That's the transition, and it's exciting. It's there's a lot of activity going on in Stevens Sweet Shop. There's a sense of excitement, movement, anticipation, and that's all summed up in the first verse. Now, as you move to the second verse, there's a minor sentence, a smog of smoke. So that introduces with the idea of smog and the idea of smoke it's thick haze, teenagers smoking, I assume. And then again, then we move on to the idea of music is being brought in, but this isn't the music of Frankie Laine yet. This is a jingle at the back of pinball being deftly played. So pinball machines are associated to an extent with teenage rebellion, excess time on your hands, you're playing games, you're in the shop. There'll have been lots of movies in the 1950s where pinball featured, and certainly in the Who song Pinball Wizard suggested some sort of rebellion against the authority of society, but it's kind of a low-key. And through the clamorous and hormone-laden haze. So this gives us the idea of these teenagers in the shop, hollering and shouting and talking and being excited, and there's the hormone-laden haze, the sense of sexuality in the air, the sense of transition. Above all of this, your voice. And we're on line 14 before we actually hear Frankie Laine getting a mention, and is your slick voice, nasal yet operatic, sliced and sawed. So there's some sort of power in the voice. It's operatic but maybe high pitched because it's nasal, but the fact that it's sliced and sawed, it cuts through all the noise that's there and yet hovers above it, almost like it's being deified, godlike, above the sort of excitement and anxiety in these teenagers' activity. And it assures them of us finding our desire at our old rendezvous. So the sense of assurance there brings some quality as to what Frankie Laine is giving them. And then there is a time shift. Today I read, so we've moved to present tense here. I read you died. So we're out of 1949, we've moved to today on Frankie Laine's died. And then the last 4 lines there give us a reflection on what his voice was. Your voice was oil, and we the water it spread on, forming a rainbow film. So the idea that this oil, it doesn't actually mix with the water, it floats above the water, and it brings something beautiful, a rainbow film, and it brings some assurance that their futures, as we felt them dreamily back there and then, that it's going to be okay. So the resolution of the tension is there is excitement and some slight anxiety about what the future will hold, but Frankie Laine's voice brings assurance that it's going to be fine. So let's pull that all together then. What is the conflict, or what is the tension? Well, there's the sense of excitement about the teenage guzzlers, the milkshakes thick as tar, the pinball being deftly played, but there's also a sort of introduction of anxiety. Boo, his smiling, slightly anxious wife, a rigid perm, an excess too bright lipstick, clamorous and hormone-laden haze, and the uncertainty of the teenagers finding their desire. Then Frankie Laine's voice is introduced, and it brings a sense of assurance to these tumultuous teenagers. And then finally, the resolution. The narrator looks back and acknowledges the inspirational impact Laine's voice had on his teenage years. It offered beauty and hope against an exciting but uncertain future. And at what level of abstraction should you work at? Well, the diner is certainly a diner. You could argue that it's the transition point between the home life and the outside world. It's a place of excitement, wonder, but it's certainly not an opium den. 1949, post-war boom is just beginning. You could argue that Laine's voice is being deified as it soars above the tumult that's going on in the diner. And you could argue, and this is maybe a little bit of a push, that the butterflying of the hot dogs literally is the splitting of the hot dogs, that's fine, but butterflying is a sense of metamorphosis, a sense of change, as a butterfly changes from a caterpillar, and that this poem is also about a transition. So how might that look when it comes to an essay? Well, here's a potential introduction for you. Updike in the poem, Frankie Laine commemorates the singer's passing. That's straightforward enough, that's what he's doing. And then this is how he's commemorating the passing. Lane's voice is forever associated with the narrator's transformation from teenage to adulthood, encapsulated in the chaos and excitement of Stephen Sweetshot. In the tumultuous period of life, Lane offers beauty and reassurance to youth. On reflection, the narrator acknowledges the inspirational effect the musician had on his teenage years. And then you could break that argument down into several paragraphs and perhaps use topic sentences, something like this. Updike's opening verse depicts the tumultuous environment with which Frankie Lane's voice is forever associated. That'd be an easy argument. And then Updike introduces Frankie Lane's voice as soaring and godlike above the clamorous hormone-laden diner. That's also quite an easy argument to make. And then towards the end of the poem, Updike reflects on the beauty and reassurance Lane's voice brought to his exciting but uncertain teenage years. And then the conclusion should open the poem up, or open your interpretation up. It's not just a repetition, it's not a summary of what's gone before, but what you're going to draw out of the argument. Updike's poem Frankie Lane explores the powerful emotions music creates in our lives and how memory recalls those emotions and the time and place in which they were forged. So now what? Thank you ever so much.